Hey, sorry, Mum. I didn't mean to call you. Okay, I love you. Bye.
How do I start? Okay, Mark.
You can never remember how to start. Do you want me to start? Really?
Yeah, you start.
Okay.
You start. Yeah.
Welcome to Crim City. I'm Josh Hanrahan.
And I'm Mark Murray. And this week we're going to talk about cocaine rips, murders, and maybe the consequences, which is just a never-ending cycle in Sydney crime.
Do you want to start with the murder or do you want to start with the drugs?
Well, I think there's been two big hits, right, that have not got a lot of attention in the last month or two. First, there was a guy at Elizabeth Hills near Liverpool in southwest of Sydney. Now, he was a person that probably his record was extended to like traffic, basically traffic, and he's then hit in a way that a top-level crim is hit. Isn't that right?
Yeah, absolutely sophisticated. Two gunmen laying in wait. Police think they may have been following his movements that day to a degree, and eventually when he arrives back in the driveway of his home at Elizabeth Hills in Sydney's far west, they jump out and open fire. And now his girlfriend was with him and she managed to escape, thankfully, but he did not. He was shot multiple times, including in the head, and died.
And that's Marvin Araha, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is. So it's interesting, isn't it, Moz? And I was saying to somebody the other day, last year when we had this spate of killings where we had, when was it? Across April, May and June of last year, we had 4 significant murders, starting with Mahmoud Brownie Ahmed, then the death of Omar Zahed and his brother Tariq, who's very high profile, was shot 10 times but survived. And then Brownie's nephew, Rami Iskander, was killed. And that was all in the space of, I think it was about 15 days. And then about a month later, so I think it was 6 weeks, Yusuf Nazlioglu was killed. But every time the phone rang to tell us that one of those blokes had been killed, it rang and the person on the other end, whether it was they were calling you or me first, not a competition,
I think it was me mainly,
Yeah, they said, Brownie's been shot.
Yep. They knew the names.
Tariq's been shot.
They
knew the
big
names.
Players. This guy wasn't.
Didn't know the names. It took a while to work it out. So what happens is that when there's a shooting or when there's an incident of any magnitude in New South Wales, the on-duty officer who kind of is in charge of the state and looking at any big incidents, they send out a text message to senior police alerting them to the incident, and it will say what pack it's in, so what police area command it's in, who was called there, why they were called there, what they found, and then down the bottom it'll have the individual and any known associations or links. And so with Marvin Araya, there was known links to organised crime networks, including the Comanchero. And so what we hear what we think when we hear something like that, that this bloke has links to the Comanchero, goes, oh, geez, okay, like that sounds serious. I don't think it is potentially as serious as that. That's kind of what we found, isn't it? He knew some people, but there was no obvious. He's not a big player. He's not a heavy hitter. He's a young kid. He was a barber before this. He cut hair at a local barbershop. And I know I wrote the story about the fact that the extent of police's intelligence on him was that he had partied with a high-profile member of the Comanchero. And
also a person believed to be involved in the commission, who, again, is a cartel trying to control the flow and price of drugs into Sydney and Australia. And that person that you name, and he's a pretty powerful person. So
Indeed.
I'm just wondering, around February, there were a rash of ultra-violent kidnappings associated, and all the talk was they were over drug rip.
Well, the first one we did was the first podcast we did was about the kidnapping of the young bloke at Balmore, who was
that's right.
allegedly brutally tortured.
Teeth ripped out, fingers cut off, next level. And there was a few other kidnappings there, some related, some not related. But we've now since learned, and I'm hearing, and I think you're hearing the same thing, there have been 2 attempts of rips of major importations.
So for the uninitiated, a rip is the gangster term, isn't it, for the theft of a large amount of drugs. It essentially means that, if one group's importing drugs, another group catches
rips
wind
them
of
off.
it.
It's a
and
rip-off.
Rips them off, yeah, spot on.
So we had two hits in the last month that haven't got made screaming headlines, but they're pretty significant. One is a young Assyrian male who was taken out in a big gangland hit, and another was a Asian man in about his 40s. A lot of gangland murders originate because somebody has ripped somebody off, either drugs, money, and then it becomes a tit for tat. But invariably you'll find at the beginning of any gangland murder or even war will start with a drug rip, invariably. Both these people, now there is talk that the Assyrians and Asian crime gangs who haven't had a huge profile, but they've been quietly, there's been murders and gangland shootings in the last 2-3 years involving particularly some Assyrian gangs who are major players. But all the attention, or maybe the limelight, has gone to bikies and Middle Eastern crime gangs. But, you know, the Hamzi Al-Madin war has actually taken all the headlines. But you've got to realise, you know, we're now hearing that these attempted rips, or whether they were done, and whether these people knew about it, were involved in it, or suspected and just got taken out, which is what can happen. It just reminds me that the Assyrian crime gangs are the most violent that have been around Sydney for 20, 30 years. So we've got to remember the Assyrians are very powerful and very, very violent gangs that people haven't really given enough recognition to. Apart from, they also have another gang which is starting to climb up again a little bit, called The Last Hour. And they're all part of that.
Which is what Sam and Marcus was part of.
And The Last Hour were a street gang that came out of those Assyrian and Latin kings, and very, very violent and ruthless crime gang. And then we go to now we're talking about Asian crime gangs, and we've seen now some of these rip-offs, some of these kidnappings are involving members of the Asian community. Now, again, they always keep a low profile, except for back again in the late 90s, while the Latin kings were running amok, the Asian crime gang called the 5T were controlling the heroin trade in southwest Sydney at Cabramatta. Again, I'm just wondering whether we're going to see another potential major conflict coming, because let's face it, the last one started over allegedly 400 Ks being ripped from the Comanchero.
Yeah.
It's just got this eerie
and it just
similarity,
bubbled along.
And it bubbled along.
And then it just
exploded, and then it was used to have other people were being killed who weren't really in the Hamzi Al-Madin war, but there was just a taste for blood out there, I thought. Last week you spent a couple of days covering a really tragic story, didn't you, up at Yamba?
I did, and we should probably just say for listeners, that story and some of the things that it relates to touch on suicide and mental health, and there's lots of places you can get help. You can always call Lifeline on 13 11 14. So, Yamba, absolutely tragic events that unfolded. So police were called to a house in Kookaburra Crescent in Yamba Thursday, I think it was the 1st of June, and they'd gone there because an elderly woman had concerns for her son, and her son was Wayne Smith. He was in his 50s, and he had a young son himself. And so when police got there and got inside, they found father and son both dead in a bed in the home, and a .22 rifle next to the bed. Was
father dead, or was he fighting for life at that stage?
No, he was dead.
He was dead.
He was dead. Yeah. And so that was tragic, and it it was reported. Police put something out. It was reported, and then
I remember you telling me, you said then you got a call from somebody.
Yeah, a couple of days later, saying
they'd taken the guns off this guy at some stage, which was quite. I thought, wow, that's amazing. And then you started digging in and found out what had really happened. And it just makes it all the more tragic.
It does. So in 2021, in August, Wayne Smith, a couple of years earlier, he'd lost his father, and he was also going through a bit of a tumultuous time in his marriage, and he'd had some mental health issues, and so he sought some help for his mental health. And when he went to renew his gun license, there's a box that says, are you having mental health issues, suicidal thoughts, etc., and he ticked the box.
Incredibly honest of him.
It was. It was.
He's almost crying for help there on a document.
Totally. But it's a red flag to the Firearms Registry, who look after every registered gun owner in New South Wales. And so within the hour, the Firearms Registry has seen this, got it, red flag, and gone, geez, gets onto the local cops, because the Firearms Registry is going to suspend his license because he's got mental health issues. Bang, the first thing they need to do is get the guns out. So the local cops go and take his guns. Wayne Smith then decides that he wants to keep his gun license. And so the process is that he needs to go through an independent review with a psychiatrist. And so he does that, and he sits down with a psychiatrist, and they prepare a report, and they say he's all good to have his guns back. He's in a better headspace. And so
that's the time frame.
So he had the guns taken away in August of 2021, and in December of 2022, so about 16 months later, they were given back to him. Now, police had also, in the Firearms Registry...
So was it just December last year?
So, yeah, it's about 6 months ago.
6 months ago.
There was a risk assessment carried out. Wayne Smith had no criminal history. You know, there'd been no other red flags. It was just this one-off, and now you had an independent psychiatrist saying, actually, he's all good. And so in December of last year, they give him his guns back. And then 6 months later, they called to his house again and find him and his son dead in a murder-suicide. And so, yeah, I couldn't quite believe it when somebody called me to say that, because, you know, it just seemed so wrong that this bloke would put his hand up in the first place and say, hey, I've got a problem. They'd come and take his guns away, and then, considering he was the one who flagged the problem, that they then give them back to him, and then you would end up in this scenario where he and his son were dead. But
it's like you think the protocols are all in place.
Well, that's the thing. The Firearms Registry, so the Firearms Registry falls under the umbrella of New South Wales Police.
And it's undergone a major overhaul.
In recent years.
For a number of reasons.
One of them was a horrible incident out in Western Sydney. Yeah, John Edwards, where he killed his teenage children who he was estranged from, and his ex-wife had been hiding herself and his young children for years.
And he went to elaborate lengths. He had his gun licence taken away from him, and then he went for elaborate lengths to get what was then called a commissioner's licence. But he was an extraordinarily evil, clever person, to the lengths he went to get his gun back, to get his licence back, to get the weapons.
Yeah, and then he tracked down his kids, killed them, killed himself.
Do you know how bad? Do you know he actually hired a car to follow them from school so that they didn't recognise his car?
Wow.
That is how pre-thought, how premeditated it was. And the fact that he then hunted them down, shot them as they were all cowering in the corner, holding each other. It's probably one of the worst domestic violence. And then he went home and shot himself.
Yes. And then his ex-wife comes home and finds her kids.
And she eventually committed suicide.
Yeah.
As you could, just a tragedy all round.
And so off the back of that, rightfully, there was a massive inquest, more than 20 recommendations of improvements for police, and there were significant changes made to the Firearms Registry and how they operated. Anyway, with the incident of Wayne Smith in Yamba and his young son, they have followed the right processes. I guess, we talk to police about it casually. Obviously we talk to cops all the time, and everybody's got an opinion, and the official line is that, they believe they follow the right processes, and everyone you speak to still says, at the end of the day, you've got a young kid, a 15-year-old kid who is dead because his dad was given his guns back, despite the fact that even though he passed the independent review, he was still receiving psychiatric and psychological treatment at the time of the shooting.
Unfortunately, sometimes these tragedies are the things that then push to find more flaws in procedures like that. You would think if somebody's still under the care of a psychiatrist, you should not have access to guns.
Totally. And I've had cops say to me, well, if you ever have a mental health issue, you shouldn't have a gun. And they're saying maybe we can link your mental, if you go through a mental health plan through the government, through Medicare. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Maybe that flags with Firearm Registry, and then you can't have a gun, then you can never get a gun again. It's a tough one, isn't it? Oh, yeah, and I guess it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this. What the coroner finds with this dad and his son, and what we can learn out of that. But there's no doubt that it's a really, really horrific So my week was pretty heavy last week, Moz. You've been at home nursing an injured shoulder. Anything catch your eye while you were sitting at home on the couch not doing much?
Yeah, well, I was just there. Like as I said, we talk about how the poor cops, got these unsolved murders, and we give them a bit of a hard time, and they've copped it with the allegation they tasered a 95-year-old lady in a Zimmer frame. But they do some good work. They busted a big drug lab.
Yeah.
How much was that worth?
$12 million.
And I know that there was a lot of good police work that went into that, from what I can gather. But the one I do love is the drug dealer, alleged, who's driving along down near Sutton Forest, which isn't far from Belangolo. Anyway, this guy's there. Police highway have spotted this car, and the car's out of rego, so they've pulled him over. And they're thinking things are a little bit suspicious. They've just decided to have a look through the car and find 5.5 kilos of MDMA worth about $700,000. Now, seriously, if you're going to be transporting drugs, do you do it in an unregistered car? I wouldn't.
Well, no, but you wouldn't want to do it in a registered car either. Well, definitely not a car registered in your own name.
No, well, a lot of the time they do it in hire cars.
Yeah, true. Or
but seriously, like having an unregistered car when they have those little things and, the cops. They've got those they detect unregistered cars.
Well, imagine if one of the other boys has forgotten to pay the rego. They're going to be in some trouble, aren't they?
Yeah, that's true. But driving an unregistered car when you're carrying 5 kilos of gear, that shows you that it does show you that the cops sometimes have a bit of help because some crims are really fucking dumb, and that helps a lot.
Well, you see how many of those trucks, like the highway between, Melbourne to Sydney and then Sydney up to Brisbane is, how often do we hear of, highway patrol or Raptor squad with intelligence stopping a truck with millions and millions
of dollars
in cash in a hidden compartment?
Yeah. There are special shops out in the southwest of Sydney where they will modify your car, and that's not making it to go faster. It's so you can hide your drugs and money in special compartments. And they're so sophisticated, it's not like to open it, you've got to turn the blinker on twice, hit the radio button, and then it'll pop. They have really sophisticated, to the point now where sometimes when they see these cars, police are now x-raying those cars to find those compartments, which obviously the stupid idiot that's driving an unregistered car, he didn't even have a secret compartment. He's not very good. But he's going to probably have a few years to figure out how to get better, because all the guys inside will say, mate, you made some fundamental errors. One of them was an unregistered car. 2 was not having it, the gear securely stored in a place where the police don't find it. So anyway, as I said, that was just one of the better stories. I really liked seeing how that happens. Well, I hope you've enjoyed listening to Josh and I in Crim City, because that's the end of our first season.
It sure is, but you can still catch us weekly on TikTok, where we go by the same name, Crim City, or in the Daily Telegraph at dailytelegraph.com.au.
And we'll be back, and we're going to come back with a few guests.
We are.
And a few more stories.
Yeah.
And keep you informed of what's going on.
If you're a Crimex Plus subscriber, I hope you're enjoying your early and ad-free access to this podcast. We've got a bunch of other great news series. One to look out for at the moment is The Missing. Listen early and ad-free at Crimex or wherever you get your podcasts.